Welcome to episode 2 of Building Your Life from the Inside Out. Now, in the previous episode, we introduced an important idea that cellular energy, that's the currency that funds human capacity. But in order to understand why energy matters so much, we first need to understand something surprising about the brain. Even though the brain makes up only 2% of body weight, it consumes roughly 20% of your body's total energy, which raises an important question. Why does the brain require so much energy? When most people think about the brain, they imagine something abstract, thoughts, emotions, memories. But biologically, the brain is a metabolic organ. Its primary function is to process information. Let me say that one more time. Its primary function is to process information. Now, in order for it to do that, billions of neurons, which are the nerve cells, constantly communicate with one another through electrical signals. And each time a neuron fires, ions move across cell membranes. Okay? Now, to reset those ion gradients, neurons have to actively pump the ions back and forth. And that active pumping requires ATP. Remember, ATP is the energy molecule or the currency that is produced inside the mitochondria. So even when you're sitting just quietly, your brain is performing an enormous amount of energy-consuming work. It's maintaining these electrical gradients, it's recycling neurotransmitters, it's maintaining what we call synaptic connections, and all of this requires metabolic energy. So when we look at the research on brain energy metabolism, okay, and it shows that most of the brain's energy is used for a few different processes. One, it maintains those ion gradients we talked about across those neural membranes. Neurons rely on sodium-potassium pumps that maintain that electrical stability. Now, these pumps, in order to move the sodium and potassium through, consumes a large portion of the brain's ATP supply. Two, it does synaptic transmission, and that's the communication between nerve cells. In order for it to do that, you need to push neurotransmitters. They need to be released. But then once they're released, they have to be recycled and reloaded again so that they can be used over and over. And each of these steps consumes metabolic energy. And number three, your brain does neural signaling. They have networks where the brain is constantly updating predictions about the environment. And it does that by integrating sensory information, it regulates the body systems, and it coordinates movement. This is an important point. When you're at rest even, your brain is looking around, assessing the environment, and then predicting what it thinks is going to happen next and starting preparation for that. So again, even when you're resting, your brain is metabolically active. And that's why the brain maintains such a high baseline energy demand. Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting. Not all brain functions require the same amount of energy. Okay, basic survival functions like breathing, your heart rate, reflexes, they're relatively stable and automatic and don't require a lot of energy expenditure. But higher order functions are much more demanding. Things like self-control, long-term planning, regulating your emotions, creative thinking, problem solving. These processes all depend heavily on networks inside a part of your brain called the prefrontal cortex. Now, the prefrontal cortex is one of the most energy sensitive areas of the brain. When energy becomes limited, the brain begins to allocate resources away from higher level function, like we discussed earlier. Instead, it prioritizes systems related to survival and immediate reward. So, when metabolic energy becomes unstable, several things happen. First, attention becomes harder to sustain. Second, emotional regulation becomes more difficult. And third, impulse control weakens. So now you're looking at attention that is fractured and distracted. You're looking at more reactive and volatile emotional responses to things. Makes sense, right? And your impulse control is weakened. Okay? These changes are not simply psychological. They reflect a shift in how the brain is allocating energy. So instead of supporting long-term planning and behavioral control, the brain is prioritizing short-term survival responses. From the outside, if you're observing this in somebody else, it may look like poor discipline, but biologically, it may reflect an energy-constrained brain. Now, this brings us back to the core idea of this series, and that is human potential is not only determined by mindset, it's also determined by biological capacity. And biological capacity depends heavily on how much energy the brain can reliably access. If the energy is unstable, the brain becomes reactive. If energy is stable, the brain can support creative planning, learning, long-term growth. This is why metabolic health is so foundational to human development. So before we ask ourselves to become more disciplined, more focused, and more productive, we should first ask a deeper question. Does my biology have the energy to support those capacities? Because the life we build depends on the brain we operate with, and the brain we operate with depends on that energy. Build the life you want from the inside out.